Gojo vs Sukuna is quite possibly one of the biggest fights to come out of shonen manga within the past decade. This fight literally transcended the mere realms of manga. Every week was just a war zone of Gojo fans versus Sukuna fans debating what comes next, what is possible and what isn't. And quite frankly, Gojo and Sukuna, they quite routinely broke the impossible. So in this video, I'm going to go through every single page and panel and chapter of Gojo vs Sukuna, and I'm going to give you every single detail that you might have missed, whether they're obvious, obscure, or pure speculation from myself based on previous evidence and future evidence that we got in hindsight. So, without further ado, let's just talk about it.
Sometimes you gotta close the door to open a window.
Open and hollow purple that was buffed was actually fired from Shibuya to Shinjuku, which is actually a pretty far distance, about roughly 4 kilometers. Now, on top of all of this, Gege made a point of noting how excelling at jujutsu is to excel at subtraction, meaning a sorcerer's skill level can be determined based on what it is they no longer need to do in order to use their chosen curse technique. And we'll see a lot of this during the fight, and I want you to keep that all in mind. So, when Gojo and Sukuna first start fighting in chapter 224, they both exchange blows. However, in this panel right here, Sukuna's kick is actually unable to land due to Gojo's infinity, and you can see Gojo's hand hovering just above Sukuna's legs as the shadow doesn't connect here. Right after this, both Gojo and Sukuna are covered in cursed energy, and this is more than likely domain amplification from Sukuna. Why? 1. Gojo dodges the punch in the very next panel. 2. Later on in the fight when Sukuna does break through Gojo's infinity, they're actually covered in the same aura. But going back to this swing and a miss from Sukuna, Gojo dodges this punch by simply laying down, but Gojo is actually just floating just above the floor here, and you can see the shadow on Gojo's body aren't connected here at the feet, just like his hand was on Sukuna's leg in their first exchange. Now, right after their first exchange, Gojo uses blue to pull Sukuna through a window, and then uses the same blue to up his own speed to get right on top of Sukuna, the same thing we see later on in this fight. We see this quite consistently within the fight. The bridge that Gojo and Sukuna are on right here breaks due to Sukuna using cleave. How do we know? In this panel, Sukuna is rolling away from Gojo, and in this panel you can actually see his hand in contact with the bridge. Furthermore, 2 perfect cuts are formed. We know Gojo can't do this. However, Gojo continues to use blue, not allowing the bridge to actually hit the floor as shown in this panel, and then proceeding to throw Sukuna into a building along with the bridge. But before that bridge can make contact with the building, Sukuna actually uses cleave once more, and we see the bridge being cut perfectly right here all the way through, and then he dodges to the right. Sukuna fires this mantle at the building behind Gojo, slicing it clean in half. Taking advantage of Gojo, look at this, Sukuna closes the gap, and from this point on, Sukuna starts to use domain amplification to break through Gojo's infinity, forcing Gojo to catch the punch. Now, this confirms for Sukuna that domain amplification can indeed get through Gojo's infinity, as he tried earlier on, back when Gojo dodged his punch, and it's also confirmed by the students in the very next chapter. From here, the two crash through the window of the building that Sukuna had dismantled, with Gojo pulling a door off its hinges in order to cover a punch at Sukuna. Now, we move a little bit further into the fight here, and we arrive at the first domain expansion clash. Now, we see all of the students and teachers talking about how Sukuna neutralized Gojo's infinity with domain amplification, as I mentioned a little bit earlier here. Now, while this isn't relevant to the Gojo vs Sukuna fight, I do think it's very interesting to point out that Higuruma had to witness Sukuna perform domain amplification just once during this fight, and was later on able to perform it to a degree on the same levels as Sukuna, literally watching this and saying, I think I get this now. Anyways, back to the fight. Just before Gojo and Sukuna unleash their domain, we see the gang talking about how Sukuna has a domain without a barrier, and Kusakabe mentions, can you paint a picture on the air without a canvas? Now, this is a direct callback to Sukuna's domain in Shibuya, where the narrator described it in the exact same manner. It was akin to painting on air without a canvas. When Gojo and Sukuna first open up their domains, it's done at the exact same time. And Gege illustrates this even further by dividing the panels between Gojo and Sukuna perfectly and displaying the text shown as overlapping white on black. While inside of their domain, both Gojo and Sukuna's clash was even. However, Sukuna's sure hit effect extended just outside of Gojo's domain, which I'm sure you already knew, but Gege illustrated it to be shown on the leaves and the trees and the ground of the surrounding domain being sliced up by Sukuna's domain. Now, as soon as Sukuna's domain breaks Gojo's domain barrier, we see an aerial view of the ground surrounding that is now a perfectly circular crater, which illustrates Sukuna's domain attack. When Sukuna starts to land slashes with his domain on Gojo, we see Gojo being grateful that, with regards to curse technique, he's overwhelmingly strong. stronger. And right here he's talking about his Curse technique versus Sukuna's rather than his versus the 10 Shadows, because as we know, the 10 Shadows is where Gojo then starts to struggle in this fight heavily. Insert Tom Hardy bait meme. In this panel, however, if you look very carefully as Gojo is being cut up to ribbons, you can actually see him smiling in this panel as he's covered in blood. And we see Gojo dashing away while getting chased by Sukuna. Now Gojo's aim here was to find out whether Sukuna himself or the shrine itself was the center of the domain. Now bear in mind, while all of this has happened, Gojo was constantly being slashed and is healing himself instantly to keep Sukuna's domain at bay. Now Gojo starts to use simple domain in order to buy himself some time while fully healing his wounds with a reverse Curse technique. However, much like what happened to Yuki against Kenjaku, we see Gojo's simple domain being ripped to shreds while inside of the domain, and Gege illustrates this as if it is a countdown, showing Gojo's feet and a small amount of the simple domain right up until Gojo is caught again by Sukuna's sure hit. Now Gojo repeats this process, but this time he doesn't heal his body and instead heals his burnt out Curse technique. Now Sukuna recognizes that this is happening because of Gojo's speed boost. In this moment, Gojo uses blue to increase his speed and to jump onto Sukuna, and Sukuna notices this and says his speed just now ... Now this is because Gojo had used blue earlier on in the fight to catch up to Sukuna when he had sent him flying through that window in their initial exchange, a speed boost that had caught him off guard there also. Now in this point right here, it is sheer speculation on my part, but I believe Gege had teased RCT on the Curse technique earlier in the series with Kenjaku. During his fight with Yuki, he mentions how he'll replenish his Curse technique, which given the knowledge Kenjaku has in Jujutsu, considering he's skilled enough to have an open domain, I don't think it would surprise me if he could use RCT on his Curse technique. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Do you think I'm just coping on that one, or do you think, like, you know, that's relatively believable? Also, by the way, like and subscribe while you're here. As I mentioned earlier in this panel right here, we can see Gojo standing just outside the range of Sukuna's domain. As we can see by the floor surrounding it has been shredded to bits, perfectly circular. This marks the second time that Gojo opens his domain within this fight, while Sukuna only expands his range. In this domain clash, it's the first time during hand-to-hand combat that Sukuna starts to gain the upper hand, as we see strikes landing on Gojo here and here, with Gojo noting how Sukuna is getting used to amplifying himself while his domain is active. Now after all this, a brief exchange of strikes, we see Gojo notice that Sukuna's sure hit is actually being switched off, and from this moment we see Sukuna in constant contact with Gojo. Now this is for a few reasons. One, Sukuna used a binding vow to increase its effectiveness outside of the barrier. Two, while inside of the domain without his own sure hit activated, there is nothing to combat Gojo's sure hit, so Sukuna had to make sure that he was in constant contact with Gojo, as a limited void doesn't affect Gojo or anyone that he is touching. Once again, Gojo's domain crumbles before Sukuna, making the score 2-0 in terms of domain clashes, and Sukuna is still maintaining the same domain. Now right here, Gojo stops using simple domain and instead opts for Fall of Blossom Emotion, a secret technique within the big three families that we actually saw Naobito Zenin using this technique inside of Dagon's domain almost the exact same way back when in the Shibuya instance. Anyways, Gojo shows us something entirely new when it comes to domain expansion, something entirely unique to him and later on Yuta Nakatsu, something I've come to call domain compression. And this is unique to Gojo due to his experience within of the prison realm here. Now this breakthrough in domains for Gojo marks his first victory in a clash against Sukuna so far, causing Sukuna's domain to collapse, dealing heavy damage to Sukuna, but simultaneously, Sukuna also broke Gojo's domain at the same time. So I guess you kind of call it like even, I guess? I'll let y'all fight about that in the comments below, just keep it civil. We now find ourselves in the reverse of what was happening earlier with Sukuna on the back foot with Gojo chasing him down. However, this is where we are shown Sukuna using the 10 Shadows, something everyone who'd been reading this fight week to week was super concerned for, and ultimately this is where the fight starts to become somewhat confusing and very concerning for Gojo. You see, Sukuna's efficacy with Jujutsu and his understanding of Cursed energy and techniques is in no short order top of the series without question. Now by the time Gojo and Sukuna come to blows, Sukuna has already fought Mahoraga once, fully understanding his abilities, has access to what Megami could do with the 10 Shadows via his memories, and on top of this he got to test it out himself during his fight with Yorozu, meaning Sukuna now has a deep understanding and intimate knowledge of what he can do with the 10 Shadows, and this will all become very important a little bit later on. But going into Gojo's 4th domain expansion and now Sukuna's 2nd domain expansion, we see Gojo using blue frequently inside of the domain to ragdoll Sukuna about while landing hits on him, once again crumbling Sukuna's domain. Now it is super interesting to me how Sukuna made a point to get rid of blue after Infinity, stripping away his abilities in sort of order of troublesomeness here, because throughout this fight, Gojo and blue are a deadly combination. You will see this a lot that Gojo uses blue in incredible ways. Anyways, Gojo lands a strike on Sukuna here and instantly activates his domain once more, marking the 5th time that Gojo has activated his domain within this fight. However, this time, Gege made it a point to change how the text of this was displayed. In every other instance, it's been white on black text, but this time it is black on white, and Gojo was shown to take up only a slight more of the panel than Sukuna has, to emphasize the slight speed difference in their domain. And I mean this in the most literal sense, meaning Sukuna took a hit from Unlimited Void for about 0.001 seconds. But it was enough for Gojo to do damage to Sukuna. However, as we mentioned before, with Sukuna having intimate knowledge of the 10 shadows, Sukuna has prepared Mahoraga inside of the shadows, lying in wait. How did Sukuna do all this though? Well, you see, Megumi's 10 shadows technique is able to hide not only himself, but weapons and also his Shikigami within these shadows, ready to strike at any moment. We see Megumi use the strategy multiple points throughout the series here, and well, Sukuna is Sukuna. So from the very second Sukuna has had Mahoraga active, how could he summon Mahoraga without even using hand signs or being able to speak after being hit with Unlimited Void? Well, at the beginning of this fight, the narrator mentions how to excel at jujutsu is to excel at subtraction. Now, if there is one thing Sukuna can do and excel at, it's jujutsu. Now, it's reasonable to believe that Sukuna can activate chaos techniques without uttering a word or moving a muscle. In fact, he actually does this exact same thing to Kusakabe when they fought, catching him completely off guard. And this is all evidence, by the way, that we need to clear up now, because Sukuna somehow managed to summon Mahoraga here, and we get more evidence of this further on down the line. But Mahoraga ends up breaking Gojo's domain instantly after having fully adapted to it. Now, it's explained that Sukuna used Megumi's soul as a means to bear the burden of adaptation. How is all of this possible? Well, once again, Sukuna having an intimate knowledge of not only jujutsu but also the soul, due to him sharing a body with Yuji all of this time, and also having been reincarnated by splitting his soul, it's definitely to be expected that Sukuna would be able to apply a chaos technique to a soul residing in the body he's in control of. But also, this is also just speculation from me here, but I do believe that at this point, Gojo was able to visually see both Sukuna and Megumi's soul in this particular panel. One orb smaller and more subdued, hinting at Megumi's soul, and the other larger and more dominant, equaling Sukuna's. Again, that is pure speculation from me. There was nothing ever confirmed about that. It was a running theory that I had about Gojo being able to interact and see souls at some way due to the 6 eyes. But Gojo mentioned back in Shibuya how he could tell just looking at Kenjaku that it wasn't actually him, and I believe that this is actually just a benefit of the 6 eyes. Again, purely headcanon from me here, speculation, but I do think the theory fits based on the evidence that we've seen. Right here, Sukuna sends Mahoraga back to the shadows, now that he's made Gojo aware that Mahoraga is in play. However, there's a couple of reasons as to why Sukuna does do this. Now, one, Sukuna is aware that Gojo at this point can take out Mahoraga in one hit, and Gojo mentioned this in the previous chapter, so having Mahoraga be present on the battlefield is only risking his trump card and being destroyed, and then ruining all the adaptation. Furthermore, Sukuna is aware that he can now bear the burden of adaptation through his fight with Gojo, thus summoning the wheel to the top of his head, because again, he doesn't need to hide it anymore. Why would he need to hide this card when Gojo already knows about it? Side note, I think this play was super on brand for Sukuna, putting the countdown in front of Gojo's face like this. It was basically Sukuna saying, like, the clock's ticking, and I like that. I think it's very on brand for Sukuna. Anyway, Sukuna explains how Gojo might have fucked himself by spamming domain expansion and using RCT to heal his chaos technique, or more rather, the area in the brain that pertains to chaos techniques. But I want to add into my point here about Sukuna being able to summon Mahoraga without chance, because he does this exact thing right here, activating the Mahoraga's Dharma Chakra with only hand signs and no chance, the same way that Megumi would. Anyways, Sukuna brags and tries to open his domain, only to be hit with the after effects of Gojo's domain, which totaled less than 10 seconds of being hit by Infinite Void. But Gojo goes on to say how his students are watching and he's going to carry on showing off, and I believe that this was him indirectly saying, this is my final lesson here to the kids. And that's another subject that I want to get into because it's different outside of this, but Gojo's chaos technique had already come back to him. As you can see here in this panel, he uses blue to pull Sukuna into him and hits him with a massive overhand here, which in my opinion, it should have been a black flash as far as I'm concerned. But hey, this is where the real fight starts. This is where it starts to kick off, because throughout this fight, we've seen Gojo use blue an awful lot, as I mentioned earlier, for speed boost, punches, and throwings in around. Now, if you remember at the beginning of the fight, Sukuna told Gojo he would strip away his scales, later on confirming how the first thing to go was Unlimited Void. Now, Unlimited Void is gone, the next thing for Sukuna to plug from Gojo's hand is Infinity, and then blue, but Gege emphasizes the troublesome nature of blue and how it can cause an opponent all sorts of troubles. As it turns out, every single punch Gojo throws is actually infused with blue, meaning he's pulling you into the punch at the same time he's connecting. So as you can imagine, this can be quite painful, as you can see on the look on Sukuna's face right here, where Gojo lands a nasty body shot. Now we are shown Gojo ragging Sukuna through a building, throwing him before trying to crush him inside of the rubble. And now as Sukuna escapes this rubble, Gojo uses the blue that he's had active to speed towards Sukuna, throwing a kick, leading into an axe kick. But it's at this point, Sukuna activates his domain amplification and uses the momentum from Gojo's own blue to dodge and then try and return that kick back to him. Now, again, I want to point out that Gojo leaving this blue active is very important detail because this happens quite a lot throughout the series, and it's very pivotal for a big moment with Gojo's sequence here. Now, this right here, this axe kick sequence was one of my favorites throughout the entire fight in terms of the hand-to-hand stuff, but this is where Gojo starts to show something completely new, truly showcasing just how creative he is and how tricky blue can be to deal with, speeding himself up to the point that he creates after images of himself to attack Sukuna, only for Sukuna to just catch the punch and return fire back, knocking Gojo away. But it's also worth mentioning that the entire time here, Sukuna had domain amplification active, meaning he wasn't able to adapt to any of these attacks yet, as the adaptation was interrupted, and Gojo figures this out, noting that when he touches him and amplification is active, Mahoraga's wheel turns black, and it thus interrupts the adaptation. Now, while Gojo is figuring this all out, he is sat on a traffic light that is stopped, and this, as the fight resumes, the light turns green. Not really important to the fight, but a really cool detail nonetheless. But once again, Gojo and Sukuna are law-abiding citizens as they both cross and they are talking here as the light signals for them to walk, which I thought was quite funny. But Gojo figures out that he's only got about 3 spins left until Mahoraga has adapted to his infinity. Now we get down to 2 spins and Gojo continues to use blue to cause Sukuna a serious amount of problems, throwing 2 blues at Sukuna and then activating multiple instances of blue surrounding him. Now this might just be a coincidence, or maybe not, but Gojo has 8 balls of blue surrounding him, which is the exact number of balls on the Dharma Chakra wheel above Sukuna's head. Anyway, by the way, take a shot every time I say blue or balls, which is quite funny. But yeah, Gojo fires 4 of these balls at Sukuna here, with Sukuna dodging all of them and sending the other 4 after him and using the speed boost to catch up to him, grabbing his leg and allowing for one of the balls of blue to rip through Sukuna's side before kicking him away. Now right after this attack, the wheel spins one more time and Gojo kicks Sukuna into a building, and for the second time in the fight, uses red on Sukuna. Now what I like about this fight is both Gojo and Sukuna both have similar game plans. Sukuna has Mahoraga in the back pocket, but hasn't summoned them just yet, and Gojo has red in the back pocket, but hasn't used it just yet, both in efforts to catch each other off guard, which I thought was very interesting. It's interesting how similar their minds sort of work throughout this fight. Anyway, Sukuna uses domain amplification to minimize the damage from red, which is also important. We'll circle back to that later. However, Gojo had used the building to curve the red around to hit Sukuna in the back, leading to Gojo hitting Sukuna with a blue-infused black flash. Remember, every punch Gojo throws is blue infused. Now, as I mentioned before, Sukuna has had Mahoraga lurking in the shadows for a while now, ready to go at a moment's notice. Now, once Gojo landed that black flash, Mahoraga's adaptation to infinity had officially finished and completed. Thus, Mahoraga comes out the shadows, grabs Gojo and slashes him down the chest, but as Mahoraga came out from the shadow, Sukuna switched with him. Now, we saw this happen as a similar thing back in Sukuna's fight with Yorozu a little while back in the domain expansion. As the fight starts to enter its final stage here, we see Gojo start to have hints of doubt and even being reminded of Toji, the last person to actually make him feel this way, which is also interesting because he feels this way after being slashed diagonally down the side, which is the exact same way that Toji slashed him. It's kind of interesting. But anyways, a 2v1 gets underway between Gojo and Sukuna plus Mahoraga, but at this point Gojo's healing has slowed down and wasn't as fast as it was at the start of the fight. Now, to amend this, Gojo would use incantations on his 3rd red blast of the fight, as doing so will restore his cursed energy output. Now, Gojo had planned to fire this at the stunned Mahoraga in this sequence here. However, Sukuna uses Escape Rabbit from Gojo's own shadow. Remember how last chapter Sukuna and Mahoraga essentially switch places through the shadows? Now, to counter this, Gojo fires the red into the shadow that has spawned the Escape Rabbits, and as this blast happens, Gege tries to slip in one cheeky wheel turn of the Mahoraga here. You can see the sound effect of it right here, and also you see a tiny little motion lines to signify it. But at this point, Mahoraga is officially adapted to Gojo's infinity, meaning he's able to attack Gojo freely, meaning when Mahoraga is in contact with Gojo, Gojo's infinity is down. Think of Mahoraga from now on as a walking domain amplification with hands, feet, and steroids essentially here. And that is also why when Mahoraga Mahoraga is attacking Gojo and Gojo blocks, Sukuna uses a piercing blood style attack on him, which actually lands. Now I want to touch base on this here for a second because I've mentioned just how skilled Sukuna is at jujutsu, and I was explained pretty heavily throughout the fight that he only needs to see something once in order to learn it. Now I've also explained how Sukuna is able to expertly use the 10 shadows to a degree that Megami could just simply never, maybe later on down the line, but right here is a perfect example of that because Sukuna combines how piercing blood is used. Instead of blood, he uses the water from Mark's elephant, creating pretty much the exact same thing. Sukuna will also have prior knowledge of piercing blood from watching Yuji fight against Choso back in Shibuya, and you could probably even argue that he already had prior knowledge of this from knowing Kenjaku back in the High Era, but again, that's speculation from me, which again loops back into Sukuna using Mahoraga without summoning rituals, hand signs, and chants, and whatnot. Now this attack also marks the first time that Sukuna has been able to draw blood and actually injure Gojo with a curse technique in their fight, because up until now, Sukuna has only been able to do this with a domain expansion, which is quite interesting. Anyway, Sukuna goes on to summon a Chimera Shadow Agito, using Totality, which is the merging of the Shadow Beasts into one Chimera Beast. Now, up until this point, we were told that this could only be achieved by the death of a Shadow, and thus other Shadows would inherit their abilities, having this explained to us way back when in Chapter 47 when Megami summoned the Divine Dog Totality. However, Sukuna once again proves that he's just simply above all that bullshit, and instead basically sacrifices Nu, Great Serpent, and Round Deer, and also a Shadow that we never actually got to meet called the Morn Tiger, or in the official translations, the Tiger Funeral. But all these beasts come together and produce Agito. Now, Agito, in tandem with Mahoraga and Sukuna, begin to try and jump Gojo. Try be the operative word. In this panel right here, we see motion lines to show Mahoraga and Agito charging at Gojo here, and as Sukuna sinks into the shadows, Gojo manages to dodge the two pretty easily here, but Sukuna appears from Gojo's own shadow and attempts another piercing blood/water attack at him. However, Gojo notices this and dodges at the last second. As you can see right here, the piercing blood flies right past Gojo's hand, but just here, both Agito and Mahoraga surround him on both sides, but Gojo slips out and bounces off Mahoraga's back and fires off a red that catches both of them in the blast. As you can see right here, the blast is fired, and here you can see both Agito's and Mahoraga's feet. There's probably going to be some freaks in my comments about that shit, honest to God. Anyway, Gojo notices that this wasn't as effective as what he'd like, leaving Gojo with only one option, and that is to take out Mahoraga in one shot with his hollow purple. Now we move into chapter 234, and this fight continues. Now, the first thing I want to point out is right here, Gojo actually hits Agito with a black flash, and Gege notes this in his volume 26 extras. From here, Agito heals himself almost instantly as Gojo throws it into Mahoraga, and he throws Agito into Mahoraga by the tail. Now, the head of said tail comes off and we see it healing in the background here, but Gojo notes that its RCT is very strong and hasn't adapted to Gojo's curse technique, but due to his regeneration, his win condition against Agito is the same as Mahoraga's. He needs to destroy each of them in one big attack, leaving no room for regeneration. Right here, Mahoraga's slashing rocks and debris at Gojo, which is stopped by Gojo's Infinity, because Gojo's Infinity is only off when Mahoraga itself is in contact with Gojo, or Sukuna is using domain amplification on it. However, right here, it's kind of mildly confusing, and it took me a while to figure this out, but it seems as if either Agito or Sukuna throws something at Gojo, as we see it land here behind Gojo, and Gojo hooks it with his leg and kicks it back at Mahoraga, because we can see right here, Mahoraga is grabbing this mystery item with his hand. But as all of this has happened, Agito is trying to attack Gojo with lightning, but Gojo just literally hits the T-pose for dominance, because again, Agito cannot touch him while Mahoraga or Sukuna is not close. Once again, punching the fuck out of Agito. However, Sukuna goes on to talk about Gojo's hollow purple and mentions how its output is over 120% when it starts to cut loose with some kind of binding valve. But Sukuna was unaware that when that first hollow purple was launched, he was unaware of Utahimi's buffs and Ichiji's barrier to help Gojo cover it all up, which is why he assumed that this was sort of a binding valve, which Sukuna mentions here how the last attack he managed to get away with only losing 2 reinforced arms when taking a direct hit at just under 4 kilometers, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But what he means here is that he was actually using domain amplification to dampen the attack in the same way that he did in this section when Gojo fired off the red to dampen that attack then. But Sukuna mentions how neither of them are at full strength, and if Gojo lands a hit with purple, even at this distance, at 100%, it would be fatal. Now, I want you to keep this detail in mind because it is very, very important, and I'll circle back to this a little bit later. But Mahoraga's adaptation finally completes here, and Mahoraga fires off a slash at Gojo, but this is the first iteration of the world slash. This is the world slash beta, essentially. And we know this for 2 reasons. 1, Mahoraga wasn't touching Gojo, meaning Gojo's Infinity was active at this point, and 2, Mahoraga was able to cut through Infinity here, and he wasn't able to do that previously. Now, as Sukuna explains at the end of the fight, this is the first time Mahoraga was able to do this, and this was because it transmuted its own ghost energy in order to neutralize and nullify Gojo's infinity. However, this was a rare time where Sukuna couldn't actually copy this, he couldn't do this in terms of jujutsu, so instead, he waited for a model from Mahoraga that he could copy, and that is how the world was born, a cut to the world and existence itself, rather than the person, by extending the curse technique. From here, Sukuna, Mahoraga, and Agito pile on the pressure on Gojo here, and what's very interesting to me here is in this flurry of attacks, both Mahoraga and Sukuna land blows, Mahoraga with this punch and Sukuna with this kick. But Agito is just off to the side here, and Agito comes up behind Gojo and tries to hit him in the back of the head. But if you notice, this punch doesn't actually connect. It does seem like it does, but it doesn't. And this is because Agito isn't adapted to infinity like Mahoraga, and he can't use domain amplification like Sukuna, which leads us into this line of Gojo saying, "You haven't been able to keep up like the others here," which is true. Agito is essentially a discount Mahoraga at this point. While he may not have been able to adapt to the attack, he can heal fast from them, but sad for Agito, that's just simply not enough to compete within this fight. So Gojo charges up a maximum output blue on Agito, and he actually punches that blue into Agito's stomach right here. As right here, we see Gojo's fist literally inside Agito. Pause. But he then sends Agito flying away, and we see Agito being pulled into himself as if it was a small black hole. I wonder if eventually Gojo, had he survived, could he have just eventually figured out how to do what Yuki does and create a black hole? Maybe. I don't know. Anyways, moving into chapter 235, the narrator mentions how Gojo has hit a second black flash, and how Gojo's voltage is ramping up. This black flash that the narrator is referring to here is what I pointed out right here, as the first one was the one that knocked Sukuna out right here and made him retreat into the shadows, and the second one was that he landed on a little bit earlier. Now Gojo goes to land his third black flash of this fight on Mahoraga right here, spinning around for Sukuna and throwing him into Mahoraga, following it up once again with Gojo's fourth black flash of the fight. Now from this point on, it marks the beginning of the end, with 4 black flashes and 3 of those being in fairly quick succession of each other. Gojo uses chance for a red attack. However, this red wasn't aiming for Mahoraga and Sukuna, who was in front of him, because if Gojo had have done this, Sukuna planned to counter this by making Mahoraga tank the attack and then completely adapt to the red, as he had done with blue, meaning Mahoraga would have adapted to almost everything in Gojo's kit apart from hollow purple. Now instead, red was aiming to the sky, where a chain of events played out. Once Gojo fired this red, it immediately rushed towards the blue that Gojo had left to float in the sky from when he had killed Agito. This is something that we had seen Gojo do multiple times in this fight that I've pointed out many times here, leaving blue active to use it as pulling force to create speed boosts and countermeasures for Sukuna to use against him. Now Mahoraga was sent to stop this event by destroying blue, as he had already adapted to it, but because Mahoraga had adapted to it, it had backfired and he wasn't able to reach it as fast as Gojo was, because he'd adapted, so he wasn't being pulled towards it in the same way that Gojo was. Landing a punch on Mahoraga and knocking him away, Sukuna appears from the shadows on Mahoraga's leg right here and tries to fire off his piercing blood/water attack in order to detonate the red. However, Gojo chants for the blue to strengthen itself to be amplified, thus attracting the attack Sukuna has fired off. Continuing the chance, both blue and red attacks combine and create hollow purple in a way that we had never seen before, and this attack completely devastates and eviscerates the entire surrounding city and wipes out Mahoraga along with it. Now here's where things go to shit with Gojo's plan. As I mentioned earlier, to keep a detail in your mind about what Sukuna had said in regards to Gojo's hollow purple, that hit from that attack, even at 100%, would be fatal. Now this would have been the case had Gojo directed this blast, but because that blast went out in all directions rather than in a focused area, it wasn't focused as a direct hit on Sukuna. And to add into all of this, I'm almost certain that a combination of both Mahoraga shielding Sukuna alongside Sukuna using domain amplification allowed him to survive this blast, but with heavy injuries. This is obviously speculation on my behalf, but given everything that we've seen from Sukuna, looking at the contextual clues throughout this fight, I believe that that is the most likely scenario. If you have any other counter arguments in the comments, I'd love to hear them. Now, as for how Sukuna lands the World Slash, later on down the line in chapters 254 and 255, we are given 2 facts. 1, Sukuna can activate a curse technique without motion or saying a single word. He literally does this to Kusakabe to scare the fuck out of him. 2, Sukuna imposed a ban and vow upon himself in order to not have to use hand signs so he could cut Gojo down, but in exchange, every single time he fires off a World Slash from that point onwards, he must use hand signs, chants, and even direct the slash. Meaning Gojo was now stood in front of Sukuna, confident in his victory, but Sukuna used a bind the valve to fire off the world slash that tore through Gojo's infinity without having to move a muscle. Now, that is a slash that Sukuna had learned from Mahoraga, expanding its target to the world, the space, and existence itself. So yeah, that now concludes every single detail that I found in Gojo vs Sukuna. Did I miss anything? Did I get something wrong? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll be sure to just call you a nerd. I'm just kidding. Or maybe I don't know. Who knows? Anyways, this video took a fairly long time to put together, I'm gonna be honest with you, and it took even longer to get it out. So if you haven't already, please be sure to like and subscribe, and also consider supporting the channel a little bit further and support me on Patreon, because it really does help if you want to see more videos just like this one. But as always, I will catch you guys all in the next one. Much fucking love, big fucking kisses, peace.